What Eric meant by Cypherpunk's Right Code is don't be one of those guys who goes to a Libertarian Party conference and sits about getting somebody elected to the Los Gatos City Council. That way lies madness.
Government is not a monolithic thing which is your enemy. It's a multitudinous thing which is your enemy.
Our dream was to enable the future of human freedom.
While solar punks join DAOs, lunar punks prepare for war and build privacy-enhanced tooling to protect their communities.
Welcome back, everybody, and thank you for funding yet another episode. This one is with Stephan Kinsella, who is a philosopher who wrote extensively about intellectual property. In our conversation, we will talk about property rights, why property rights exist, what their justification is, and also if it applies to ideas. So, can you own an idea? And this is particularly interesting when it comes to the digital realm, because in cyberspace we also are dealing with information, and information, as we will find out, is not scarce. In the second part of this episode, I discuss Monero with Stephan, but we will get to that when we get to it. So right now, let's jump right in and welcome Stephan Kinsella. Yes, I'm very excited to talk to you. You're one of my intellectual heroes, I have to admit, because you very much shaped my thoughts on intellectual property. But I want to give you the opportunity to introduce yourself for the audience members that may not know you.
Okay, I'm an American patent attorney, mostly retired now, and a longtime libertarian. I live in Texas. I'm from Louisiana. And I practiced in large law firms for a long time, and then in the corporate world as an in-house lawyer, and then with my own practice. But in the meantime, at the same time, over the last 30 years, that's my poodle. I've written a lot on libertarian theory from mostly from a Austrian and anarchist point of view. Mm-hmm. And recently, I just kind of compiled a lot of my major works into a book, and updated and edited, and that's it here behind me on the shelf here. So this is my book that came out late last year, and it's got most of my. It's a chunky book. It's got most of my my libertarian theory on intellectual property, on rights theory, contract theory, and causation, and other things like the inalienability and those types of issues.
All right. So we have really a heavy hitter when it comes to anarchist thought here with us. So I want to kind of play devil's advocate here. I'm also kind of versed in libertarian thought, but I guess not as deeply as you are. So one of the main points, or one of the points that always comes up when I discuss anarchist thoughts with other people, is this question of objective rights versus subjective rights. So maybe just to paraphrase in my words, and you can correct me if I get any of this wrong, there's basically two schools of thought. One is the right positivists, where they say basically, well, if the government says something is right or wrong, that's right or wrong because the government says so. And the other approach is, no, our rights come from nature, from the fact that we are human beings inhabiting the earth. And Rothbard goes into this in Ethics of Liberty. But there's always this rift that I end up with, where we come to the point where I say, oh, these are natural rights, and I recognize them with my capacity for reason. And then my discussion opponent says, well, I don't see it this way. So do you get what do you understand what I'm driving at here? This justification from natural rights, and how you would put it.
Well, there's a lot of complicated issues here. And it's complicated in part because people use different language differently, and the theories about this are all over the map and very confused. For one thing, so I've never heard it called subjective versus objective. I see what you're getting at. I think what you're discussing more is legal positivism,
Yes.
versus natural law, but that's not even always in the debates. That's not what the versus is. Sometimes it's just natural law versus utilitarianism, or natural law versus consequentialism. This logical positivism is, legal positivism, which, by the way, is related in some weird way to logical positivism, which is something most people never make that connection. I've got a blog post about that. It's not relevant here, but legal positivism. And then one more thing before I dive into it. This debate about the nature of rights and legal positivism versus natural law, or natural law versus consequentialism, it's really a debate that's not specifically relevant to anarchy. It's a debate that's relevant to any form of government. I mean, if you're going to have this debate, the question to me, there's two questions. What should the law be? And then should there be a state that enforces the law? Like those are kind of two separate questions, right? And then your views on legal positivism or your criticism of natural law might play a role in what you say. But I think so most, and I'm a critic of natural law too, in a sense, and I'll try to get to that. Most people that claim to be critics of natural law, I think, are a little bit disingenuous. So for example, if you say you're a total legal positivist and you think there's just no objective law and there's no way to know what the law is unless there's some sovereign that announces it, and that's got to be the government. That's sort of like a Hobbesian argument. You can't have law from anarchy, which is just plainly false. I mean, there have been anarchic legal systems. Law can emerge without the state, just like you can have roads or education without the state. Whether you should have a state is a separate question, but it's clearly possible to have law. International law, for example, exists, even though there's no international sovereign that enforces it, but it does exist. Although some legal positivists would say it doesn't exist because there's no world government. But I think it's clear, if you know anything about law, that international law is a type of law and does exist. But most legal positivists, or so-called legal positivists, they have opinions about what the law should be. For example, they'll go to the U.S. Supreme Court and argue a case, and they'll say, well, my client should win. And they're trying to persuade the judges to construe the law in the Constitution, let's say, in a certain way, because they're hoping that the judge's decision, which will shape what the law is, the positive law is, will conform to this higher standard that they have in mind, which they prefer. Like, for example, if you're some kind of modern lefty, in America we call liberal, and you say you're a legal positivist who doesn't believe in natural law because you equate it with the Catholic Church or something like that, and you think that's superstitious religion, they will still oppose the Supreme Court saying that abortion can be regulated by the states. And they will fight that over and over again. And they'll say the Supreme Court got it wrong. Well, what did they get wrong? They always have a higher law standard in mind, which is all that normative thinking does. And that's what natural law thinking does. We basically say that there's an ideal law that we think we should have, and that it's better when the positive law, the law that's enforced in a given society, whether it's enforced by the state or privately, you prefer for that positive law to conform to this ideal law standard that you have. So then the anarchy debate is about whether a state is justified and legitimate and necessary for law. And then the substance debate is what you think the law should be. Now, we libertarians have a certain conception of the law, and I would say that the private law in the West and most people have a more or less libertarian view of this ideal law, the standard that we think actual law should conform to. So the private law is roughly libertarian because it's the private law, by which I mean like contract law, criminal law, tort law, marriage law, all the private things. Those things are based upon the idea that people can homestead natural resources and they become the owner. They can transfer them by contract. And if you violate those rights by using it without someone's permission, that's called trespass or murder or theft. Those things are prohibited by the law. So the law is more or less libertarian because it conforms to the core libertarian principles. It's just that we're more consistent and rigorous and systematic about it. Most people would say, yeah, murder's wrong and theft is wrong. But if you say, well, then why do you support taxation? Then they'll say, well, I'm going to have to make an exception for the government. So they're not consistent. They'll make exceptions, right? Now, there are lots of interesting and good anarchist works out there. I've never been a deep anarchist scholar in the sense of writing on how the system would work with protection agencies and insurance. Others have done that. Hans Hermann Hoppe, Bob Murphy, and earlier writers. I agree with almost all that. My writing has been mostly on just identifying what it means to be, like in one of the chapters of my book, is what it means to be what I call in the book an anarcho-capitalist. I don't tend to use that term much anymore because I try to be a little bit more descriptive, and I say anarcho-libertarian or anarchist libertarian. To my mind, if you're a consistent libertarian, you are an anarchist. And conversely, if you're an anarchist, if you're a genuine, consistent anarchist, you have to be a libertarian. Like, you can't be an anarcho-communist. To me, that's a contradiction, because communism is going to result in a state, and libertarians who are minarchists, I think they're still libertarians, but they're just inconsistent libertarians. And the reason is because they oppose aggression most of the time, but they make exceptions. Like, the state can commit aggression to conscript you or to tax you or to outlaw competition. That's the main things the state can do in their mind. And their argument is usually that it's necessary. That without that, and they think it's necessary because they think that law and order and what we call government is impossible without the state. Why they think that is a mystery, because we have international law and we have order on the international stage with 200 state actors who are not governed by a one world government or a super government. So clearly law and order are possible without government. Without the state. That's another distinction I try to make. A lot of people use the word government and state synonymously, and I make that mistake myself sometimes too, and you can't avoid it sometimes. But technically, the state is what we're opposed to. And the reason we're opposed to it, and that's what I've written on, is not because we have a plan or a system. Like, we have an anarchist system that we think will be better than system A, B, or B, C, or D. That's the whole point. We don't think there should be a system. We simply think that rights should be respected, and that we condemn and we oppose aggression. And aggression, again, is not a primary term, which a lot of libertarians, like the early Randians and some anarchists, they talked about the non-aggression axiom. Nowadays, they tend to call the NAP, the non-aggression principle. I think the reason is because they started calling it the non-aggression axiom because Ayn Rand used the word ax, and she was like probably the originator of the modern libertarian movement with her. Although she would hate she would hate that accolade, but because she hated the competition. But I think Ayn Rand was the beginning of the modern libertarian movement, which is why there's a hilarious and great book by Jerome Ticilli called "It Usually Begins with Ayn Rand." Nowadays, that's changed. The libertarian movement is much bigger, and I think in America, the Ron Paul movement in 2008 or so expanded our numbers greatly, and it also made us more radical. Like, before that, most libertarians were minarchist, Randian types, but they were also more intellectual because they had read a lot more. I think for two reasons. Number one, there was less to read. The movement's just so much bigger now. And number two, it was before the internet. So after Ron Paul, we brought in a lot more people, and ironically, they're more radical, and they're also more familiar with Austrian economics because of the rise of the prominence of the Mises Institute and Austrian economics over the last couple decades. So they're more familiar with Austrian economics. They're more anti-war. They're more kind of pro-gold and that kind of stuff, anti-central bank. And they're more radical, more likely to be anarchist. And yet because of the internet and the way people consume information now, and because the way we get these people as part of like a political campaign, they're not quite as intellectual as the old guys. So it's like you have this weird dichotomy. But anyway, Ayn Rand used the word axiom in an idiosyncratic way. You know, usually in the humanities or in, say, mathematics, an axiom is just a basic postulate of a logical system. Ayn Rand used the word axiom to mean roughly what the Austrians mean by a priori. It simply means a core or fundamental basic statement that is obviously true because denying it would lead to self-contradiction. So like she called, the axiom, A is A, she would say, or existence exists, or there is such a thing as consciousness. Like you can't deny that the universe exists, and you can't deny that there's consciousness, because if you deny it, you're someone aware of something that's denying. It's a proof by self-contradiction, and so are lots of Austrian economics axioms, like aspects of praxeology and things like that. But anyway, she used the word axiom to refer to these fundamental truths. And so I think initially, and then she also formulated rights as no man may commit an act of violence or the initiation of force against other people. And another word for that is aggression. So people that were influenced by Rand started saying, well, we believe in the non-aggression axiom. Even Rothbard, I think, used that terminology for a while, and he was influenced by Rand himself. Later on, people realized, well, it's not necessarily an axiom, because some people might not agree that it's self-evidently true, but they still favor those principles. So let's just call it a principle, and then we can disagree, or we can argue or discuss over how you justify these principles or what your basis is. So some people might favor the non-aggression principle for utilitarian reasons, because they, like Mises, he was a consequentialist. He understood that, because he understood economics and the nature of governments and the nature of man, that if you want peace and prosperity and harmony among mankind, then you should have free markets and property rights, which kind of implies the non-aggression axiom. That's a long-winded way of getting to my point that aggression is not a fundamental, even though people call it the non-aggression axiom or principle, it's not really fundamental. It's more of a description. Aggression is a description of what happens when someone uses someone else's resources, which you could call their property, without their consent. So you can't know what's aggression unless you know who owns what. So that means property rules are foundational and more fundamental and more primary than aggression. Aggression is just a way of describing what we prohibit, what we oppose. We oppose using someone else's stuff without their permission. Well, what's their stuff? And then the answer to that is these core rules of Western private law, which libertarians are very consistent about. And that is, first you own yourself, self-ownership. Then that person who owns himself or his body can go around the world and he can homestead things or appropriate things that are unowned. That's original appropriation. Or he can transfer to someone by his consent, which is contractual title transfer. And then there's a third way, which is if you commit an act of trespass and you harm someone, then you owe them some damages. You owe them some payment, some restitution, what we call rectification. So that would be another transfer of ownership from me to you to compensate you for something I've done. And those four principles or so are like the core of all law and all libertarianism. But none of that implies, well, I think it implies anarchy if you're consistent about it, but that's just because if you oppose aggression, which means violating these core property rights principles, you'll see that the state by its nature has to commit aggression. And if someone responds, well, but the state is necessary, that doesn't change the fact that they're violating rights. It's still aggression. So, if someone commits murder and they say, well, it was necessary that I commit the murder, it's like, okay, maybe you can make some weird argument that it's necessary, but it's still murder, right? And the reason the state is necessarily an aggressor is because it does one of two things by its nature. And in fact, it always does both, but it at least does, it either outlaws competition, because that's how it becomes a monopoly service provider of government services and law and order in a given region, or it taxes. Either one is sufficient to make the other one happen. So for example, if you have just the power to tax, then you can tax people in an area and then you can just subsidize your services and provide them more cheaply than the competitors and put them out of business. On the other hand, if you can outlaw competitors, then you have no competition and you can charge very high prices, which is the same thing as a tax. So they both imply each other. And of course, invariably, states do both. Either one of those things is a violation of the property rights, what we just mentioned. That's why the state is illegitimate. And then other theorists have shown working examples in history to show that anarchy is possible. So you can't say that the state is necessary. It is clearly possible to have the provision of law and order and what we call governance or government privately. That's clearly possible. You might think it's better to have it done with a monopoly state, but the state is still committing aggression and violating the core principles. So that's one thing. Now, if you want to talk about this issue about natural law, let me just say this. I do think that, as I said, Mises's case was consequentialist. And I think most people's case is consequentialist in the sense of most people happen to already share certain core values of civilization. Not psychopaths and sociopaths, but most people, they're self-interested, but they also care about their family and their friends and their community and even strangers to a degree. They have empathy because we're a social species. And we would prefer to live in a world of peace and prosperity and harmony than a world of fighting and violence and conflict and chaos. So people already have these values. As Mises said, if you prefer peace and prosperity, then you should favor the free market because that's the means to achieve this shared end that we all have. I don't see many people, even people that oppose natural law, disagreeing with these ends. They're human beings, and they also, if pressed, they would say, I favor peace and prosperity too, sure. And then if you say why, they would say, well, no one knows. It's just an arbitrary preference because I don't want to believe in your God. They don't want to be trapped into making some natural argument, but they'll say, okay, I happen to prefer peace and prosperity. It's like, okay, that's good enough for me. You do. Now, if you understand a little bit of economics, you'll see why we need to have free markets and property rights. It's pretty much that simple. I myself think there are problems with the natural law argument in this sense. As Hans Hermann Hoppe, who's one of my biggest influence probably, as he's explained. And by the way, Murray Rothbard even conceded this later. So Rothbard kind of adopted the natural rights thinking of the Enlightenment, this kind of Lockean idea that, man's nature implies what rights he has. That's sort of Ayn Rand's argument too. But Hans Hermann Hoppe later was more of a Kantian, and because he's a Kantian and also a Misesian, he recognizes the distinction in theory between, say, a priori and a posteriori statements, right? Also, he recognized the distinction between the two domains of analysis, the causal or the natural sciences domain, and then the teleological domain, which studies human action, and which is the realm of phenomena where humans have a range of options they can choose from, and they have an end in mind, and then they can choose which end to pursue, and they can choose which means to achieve it. And so that's what human action is, and that's why economics, Austrian economics, studies with praxeology the structure of the implications of these choices in human action, right? So he recognized these distinctions, and as part of that, he recognized that there's one problem with the natural law argument, and that is that you're jumping domains. You're going from an is to an ought. And there's a classical criticism of the is or the natural law argument, is that you're saying, and I think it was David Hume that pointed this out. It's like you're talking about is statements. All of a sudden you say what ought to be done. You can't. What Hans would say, Hoppe would say, is this that divide is logically unbridgeable. And I think he's correct about that. You cannot deduce an ought from an is, because once you switch domains, you have to insert your own values or your own norms or your own oughts. And that's what we do with consequentialism. What we say is the factual thing is what happens in economic analysis, the implications of human action, right? The way property and free markets work. But we take for granted a certain shared set of values that everyone happens to share. And then we say, given if you believe in peace and prosperity, now listen, if you don't believe in peace and prosperity, yeah, you shouldn't favor free markets, but then we're going to treat you like an outlaw. You're not part of society, and we're going to just treat you, as Hoppe calls it, a mere technical problem. But And then Hoppe's argument, Hoppe has his argument for rights called the argumentation ethics. And what he tries to do is he tries to say that we don't just happen to have these shared values, which you could call, I call them Grundnorms after some legal philosophy of Hans Kelsen. Grundnorms, like basic root norms. Hans tries to say they're not arbitrary and we don't just happen to share them. It doesn't just happen to be the case that 95% of humans happen to have those values. What Hoppe argues is that they're undeniable, or they're almost like axioms, or they're a priori, because you could never deny it in argumentation, and that's the only place you could deny it. You could only deny it in a conversation where you're making the statement, I don't agree with that, and you're trying to persuade someone that they're wrong. But in that very discussion, you're already necessarily adopting certain norms. These are the norms of argumentation. In other words, peace and self-ownership have to be presupposed and operative for you to have a meaningful conversation. So it's like the very only context in which you could deny or argue about this. Everyone necessarily already values the Grundnorms that then you can build on and refer to. So in a sense, it's what he calls it the ultimate argument for libertarianism. And I agree with this argument. I think it's correct. But in a sense, it's just pointing people's attention to the fact that they already have these values. And no one wants to deny these values anyway. No one's going to, in an argument, say, well, I believe in human suffering and I think rape is good. So now what do you say to that? It's like, well, I don't want to talk to you anymore. I don't want you to come to my birthday party. So the criticism of natural law has a point. Now, this interesting debate about legal positivism, the natural law types, I think, go too far in their criticism of legal positivism. For example, they don't want even like natural law. They use the word, the letter law, the letter capital L law. They capitalize it like some Roman Catholic cranks or something, because they think that words have power. There's some mystical thing if you capitalize a word, and they don't want to admit that, like, let's say there's a law that's I don't know, some like the drug war. I don't know, putting someone in jail for life for smoking marijuana. They would say that's not a law. They don't want to give it to give it the classification of law, because they think that once you name it as law, so they don't see a difference between real law with a capital L and positive law. I think that's just wrong. I mean, I think it's clear that there's nothing wrong with running around in a human society and identifying and recognizing there are positive laws. There are laws in effect and force in a society. And then you can criticize it by holding it up to a higher standard that you think is the more ideal or moral law. You don't have to call it natural law. You can just say it's the preferred law or whatever you want to say. So, I'm not going to say that the tax law in the US is not a law, because it clearly is a law. And if you pretend like it's not a law, you might end up in federal prison, like some people have, like Irwin Schiff, Peter Schiff's father. That's why these income tax nuts and they're cranks, and they have this mystical view of law as once you give it the name law, then you're saying it's legitimate. I think you can clearly identify what law is, and then you can say what the law should be. So then the libertarian view is what the law should be is law compatible with a consistent application of the property rights assignment principles I mentioned earlier. And again, I think consequentialism is not incompatible with sort of a more moral or principled or deontological case for rights, because we're all like the blind man feeling the elephant. We feel different parts of it, but we're describing the same reality. So it's no surprise that there's a convergence between practicality and principles, between morals and consequences. I mean, even Ayn Rand said that there's no really dichotomy between these things. She said the moral is the practical, because the purpose of morals is to help men lead a good life according to their nature. So that's why nature enters into this, because the norms that we all tend to favor, the values that most humans share, even if you don't believe you can make a Hoppian type argument that's an ironclad argument for it, they're still not arbitrary. There's a reason we choose them, because they're compatible with our social nature as human beings who evolved to live as social creatures, and we evolved to care for each other and to get pleasure out of having other people that we, to intercourse with. So it's hard to deny that nature has no role in the values that we all tend to share, and that people do happen to share. And then again, like I said, the anarchy question is separate, but I think you have to deal with that as I dealt with it earlier. So that's a long-winded answer, but I'll let you jump in now.
Yeah, amazing. So now, when we talk about these principles, do I understand you correctly that we arrive at the principle, for example, of self-ownership, not because there is some God-given right, for lack of a better term, but because from a consequentialist perspective, life just tends to be filled with less conflict if we have these principles, for example, of self-ownership and homesteaded material property? Well,
I think the principles have been present in human society to one degree or the other for thousands of years. And there's a reason for that, right? The reason is because we've never been an atomistic species. You have to reproduce, and people even in early days lived in tribes and with each other. And so there was some form of cooperation and trade and, social people helping each other, things like that. I mean, the way I look at it would be from an Austrian economic or Misesian praxeology point of view, that every moment in your life, every moment in the life of a human being, an actor, you're always aware of your circumstances. You're aware of the past, because we have memory. You know some things about the world because we have some understanding and comprehension of the world. You know facts. You know where things are, what things are. You know something about causal laws. You know something about what will work, what won't work, what will feed your hunger, what won't work. And we have some idea about the future. We know that time is passing, and so we're always aware the future's coming. And as Mises says, the thought of a certain future, the one that's coming, makes you uneasy or uncomfortable, or you don't like it, or you think, I'm going to be unhappy in that future world if it comes to be. Like if I start feeling hunger pains, I know that if I don't do something about it, then at some time in the future, I'm going to be very miserable, and I don't want that to happen. So the thought of the future where I'm starving makes me uneasy. And my knowledge about what I can do about it impels me to look around and maybe catch a fish and start a fire and, cook the fish and eat the fish. And when I do that, I'm using means to intervene in the course of events. These are means that are causally efficacious, which means they actually work. Like if I want it to rain and I do a rain dance, that's I won't say it's irrational, but it's just it's inefficacious. It's not really going to make it rain. And over time, people learn what's just bullshit and what's scientifically sound, right? So we live in a world of scarcity, basically, where we're always facing these uneasiness moments and these problems. So you might die of disease. There might be a hurricane coming. There might be a wild animal. There might not be enough food around. Life is difficult, right? That's what the challenge always is. Now, when we live in society with other people, we start learning that when we need to employ these means to achieve success. But these means are necessarily what Mises would call scarce, or what I call, what economists might call rivalrous, and what I would call conflictable, things that you can have conflict over. And so when you live among other men, there's a benefit to living among other human beings. You're not lonely, they can help you. You can trade with them. Then you have the emergence of the division of labor and trade, specialization and division of labor. And so you can lead a better life that way. But the danger of living among other men is that, if you were living alone on a desert island like Crusoe, Robinson Crusoe, you still have all these obstacles facing you. You have to use scarce means and all this. But one thing you don't have is the danger of theft. No one's going to steal your spear that you made to catch your fish. On the other hand, you can't go down to a store and buy a spear because there's no division of labor. So you're missing out. So if you have the benefit of being in society, we would like to minimize that other source of that endangers your ability to successfully use means to live your life, which is conflict with other human beings over these things. And because most people are also empathetic and they value their neighbors too, and also because they recognize that violence is wasteful. At most, there's one victor. But even he is probably worse off in such a society where there's no. So people tend to favor these rules, the rules that say, okay, listen, when there's other people in society and we all need to use these scarce means to do things, we need to have some rules that everyone respects. And then we can use these things peacefully and trade. And then we don't have to worry about being mugged or beaten or whatever. And so then what are the rules that have tended to emerge and why? Well, the first one is self-ownership, because everyone lives in their body and they don't want to be attacked. So everyone has that same interest, which is why self-ownership becomes like a core bedrock principle. And because we all need to use means in the world to survive, that means there has to be unowned things that were out there that people had to first start using. Otherwise, they would all starve to death. So that means that one of the rules has to permit people to be the first one to use an unowned resource. So that's original appropriation. And if someone could just take it, if a second person could just take it from the first person, that would be generating conflict, and it wouldn't give me any incentive to homestead them in the first place. So that's why, as Hoppe calls it in his book, A Theory of Socialism and Capitalism, the latecomer always has a worse claim than the prior. So that's the prior-later distinction. So out of these simple reflections and the simple logic and the practicality of the situation comes self-ownership and original appropriation. And then we recognize that people that own things can do what they want with it, including give it to someone else. So then you have contract. So it's not that hard to see why these rules emerge and why they could be the only objective rules that would serve to satisfy the original purpose of people coming together to come up with these rules, which is they want to be able to use means productively and they want to avoid conflict. A rule that generates conflict is, you might as well just go back to the state of nature and warring, because it's the same thing. So if you allow people to declare property rights by what Hoppe calls a mere verbal decree, that wouldn't reduce conflict, because anyone could claim ownership of anything. You could have 1,000 people saying, I own that tree because I say I do. Or I own that plot of land, or I own Australia, or I own the moon, whatever, or I own your body. But the problem is those rules would only generate conflict. That's why every property claim has to be based upon some visible objective link that you can demonstrate to other people. You can show you're the first one, or you can show a chain of title that I got it by contract from a previous owner who had it. That's why you have to mix your labor with things or embroider it somehow to stamp your personality on it and make a connection between you and this thing. That's the only way to do it that would not generate conflict. And that doesn't generate conflict, because if it's an unowned resource and I'm the first one to start using it, no one else can complain because they're not the owner. For them to complain, they would have to be the owner. But by assumption, I'm the first one to use it. So the only way they could be the owner is they decreed it with verbal decree. But again, verbal decree can't be the basis of ownership. So this is sort of how the Hoppian, and my view, which I think is roughly based in some way on common sense economics, on the history of how mankind emerged, and on even some of the natural law insights. I mean, Locke was basically correct in the overall structure of his argument. Now, he had to word it in religious terms. He said, every man owns himself because God gave it to him. And then God gave the earth to man in common, but that means unowned. And because God wants us to flourish, we have the right to go and homestead these things. Now, his argument, in my view, has a fatal flaw. Well, it's not a flaw. It's an unnecessary step which has led to flaws. What he argued was God gives every person ownership of his body, himself, And if you own yourself, you own your labor. And if you own your labor, then you own unowned things that you mix your labor with. Now, I think he's correct that if you mix your labor with an unowned resource, you own it. But it's not because you own your labor. It's because you establish the first objective connection to the thing. But you don't own your labor or your action. Your action is what you do with things you own. It's just a description of how you move around the world. It'd be like saying a jogger owns his running or a singer owns her singing. It doesn't even make any sense. She owns her body, and that gives her the ability to sing. But you don't own your running. And the problem with that mistaken extra step in his argument is it has led to, well, we call that the labor theory of property. And the problem with assuming that you own your labor is it gives rise to, well, I think it gave rise to the labor theory of value in economics, which I guess was expounded by Smith and then Ricardo and then adopted by Marx. I mean, this is why Marxians say that workers were exploited. They were exploited because they're the ones that, with their labor, they created, the cars on the assembly line. And if the employer is making a profit at all, he's got to be taking the surplus value of their labor that they owned, because that went into the car, and that's why the car has value. So like, they don't understand subjective economics and all this stuff. But the point is, Locke's mistake there, I believe, led to the communism in a sense, labor theory of value. And it also led to the intellectual property idea, because once you start thinking like that, like I own my labor and I own things I mix it with, it's a short step to say, yeah, I created that farm. So I guess what Locke means is that we own things that we create. Well, don't I create a poem or a novel or an invention with my mental labor? And so you see how this fixation on labor, I think, if I was a totalitarian dictator, I would outlaw the word labor, because it led to so much problem. I mean, if you think about it, economists talk about action and they divide it into two types, logically two types. One is labor, one is leisure. Just like some goods are consumer goods and some are capital goods or production goods. What's the difference? Well, the consumer goods are to be immediately consumed. They directly satisfy consumer needs. They're consumed. Intermediate goods or production goods or capital goods are things that you value because they help in the end result in consumer goods, right? So there's a distinction. Likewise, there's a distinction in action between labor and leisure. Labor are things you do. Leisure is like the analog of consumption. It means something you do because you want to do it, because you're enjoying it. Labor is things you have to do to save up enough capital or to get the goods you need or the resources you need to have leisure, right? So labor and leisure are just two types of action. If it makes sense to say we own our labor, it would make sense to say you own your leisure. What does that mean? I'm sleeping on a hammock on a beach. Do I own that sleeping activity? It doesn't even make any sense. And so once you let go of that confusion and you realize, as I mentioned earlier, the source of rights has nothing to do with creation. Original appropriation and contract are not creating activities. The first one is original appropriation is a transforming activity. It's a way of transforming a resource or making a connection between you and bordering it, like putting a fence around it, building a house on it, transforming a tree into a couch, into a chair or something. It's a transforming activity, but it's not creating. And in fact, if creation was a source of ownership, again, you get this Marxian idea that, well, the workers on the assembly line created the cars. Why don't they own them? The reason is because they didn't own the input factors, right? If I take some unowned wood in the forest and I make a chair out of it, I own the chair because I own the wood already. When I made the chair, when I chopped the tree down and took it, then I became the owner at that point. And the reason I own the chair is because I already owned the wood, not because of the shape I made it into. I owned it already. Likewise, if I go to your house and I take a block of marble on your front lawn and I carve a statue into it, I've created a statue. But I don't own it because it wasn't my raw material. In fact, I might owe you damages, right? Because I damaged your property. And by the way, the law perversely would give me a claim. Like if I created a statue If I stole a canvas and paint from your house and I made a $1 million painting out of it, the law might make me pay you back, $50, but I get to keep the rest because it would be unjust enrichment or unfair or something. So the law is not always fair. Anyway.
So the distinction, like I'm a very simple mind. So to me, you can only have property rights in tangible goods, like in material objects that surround us, but not in intangible concepts, like you said, labor just now.
Correct. Or you might call them corporeal, which is more of a civil law term, or material. And the reason is because think about the word property rights. They're considered to be enforceable. Like the word force is part of this notion. And force is a physical thing. You can only lay your hands on physical things. And again, the physical things. So the distinction I made earlier about human action being successful, it requires, the way I look at it, and praxeology helps illuminate this. Successful human action has two primary ingredients. One is available means and knowledge. You have to have knowledge that guides your actions. You have to know what cause and effect are. You have to know technical, scientific things. You have to know recipes. You have to know where things are. You have to know what you want. You have to know what's going to satisfy your desires. You have to have knowledge. So the knowledge guides your action. But again, remember, the reason property rights emerge is because these scarce means of action, the physical things that we have, that we can, they have to be physical, because to act means to intervene in the course of affairs in the world. So the means have to be, what I said before, causally efficacious. That means they need to do something. And the only things that can do things and interact with other things are physical things that interact with other things and change the course of events. And the only way you can have a law that's enforceable by physical force is to apply it against physical things. It's simply, not only is it unnecessary or unjust to have property rights in intangible things like knowledge or ideas, it's literally impossible. So you just can't have a law that says you own this idea. You can say that, but what that means is the law's really doing a disguised transfer of property rights in intangible real things. So as a simple example, if I have a patent on an iPhone, which Apple has, and someone else makes a smartphone with a touch screen with rounded corners, then Apple doesn't really own the idea of that. But using that patent grant, which words it like that, they can go to a court made of physical human beings with bodies and having, the military force of the country with physical guns, with physical bullets and physical jails, issue an order against my competitor, which says you may not use your factory to produce smartphones with a touchscreen. And if you do, we're going to arrest you because you're violating an injunction, or we're going to take some of your money and steal it from you. So really what the law says is, I own your factory. I own your money, right? Those are real things. Copyright's the same way. If someone publishes bootleg copies of a Harry Potter book, J.K. Rowling or her publisher can take money from that person. So it's really about who owns the money that the person owns. And in trademark law, for example, if someone is selling $10 Rolex, fake Rolex watches in a street market somewhere in China, then the government agents can come in and seize those watches and destroy them. So it's about ownership, because it's violated a trademark, even though no one was defrauded.
At this point, the connection dropped out, but after a few short seconds, I was able to reconnect.
Yeah, and so this is an illustration of the reason why there cannot be property rights in intangibles. And if you try to do it, you always end up, in effect, taking property rights in tangible things. It's very similar to positive welfare rights or to monetary inflation. Mm-hmm. Some simple-minded people say, why don't you just print more money and give it to the poor? They conflate money with wealth. But of course, if you print more money, you simply dilute the value of existing money, and you don't create any wealth, you just redistribute it. And people say, well, I believe in negative rights like property rights, but I also believe in positive rights like the right to housing and food and education. But if you keep adding positive rights to the list, the positive rights have to come from somewhere. They have to come at the expense of negative rights. There's no way to have both. Just like there's no way to just give everyone lots of money and everyone's richer. It's impossible. And likewise, if you assign rights in intangible things, that always violates rights in real things, and it violates the core property rights principles I mentioned earlier.
Yeah, this reminds me of the quote by Ayn Rand when, I don't know, she talked about some architect who is dreaming up his dream project, and then the basic question is always, and who will pay? And if it's not the person who is trying to do that, like the legitimate owner, then of course it's not so noble anymore when you have to steal your funds to achieve your dreams.
Yeah, and ironically, the first book I read that got me interested in libertarianism was The Fountainhead by Ayn Rand about the architect. And that led me to lots of other stuff, which eventually led to me being anarchist and all that. But The Fountainhead was the very first thing I read, and I loved it. But now, in retrospect, I wonder why. There's nothing libertarian about that book. You have this bizarre, narcissistic, almost sociopathic architect. I want to say almost. So he dynamites someone else's project because it used his design. Yeah. So he's like an IP, intellectual property terrorist, even though he did it by a contract that he wasn't even officially part of. And I think his excuse was that, it was his creation and they violated the terms of the contract. I'm like, with Peter Keating? No, They didn't. And that's not your business anyway. You can't go dynamite someone else's thing. And plus there's a quasi rape scene in there too. Like the whole, I think the thing that appeals to libertarians about that book is it's very individualist. Yes. It appeals to individuals, and individualism, might lead you to. I mean, Atlas Shrugged is clearly a very libertarian book, but and her other stuff, but not that book.
Yeah, the quote that stuck with me the most is by Howard Roark, so the architect, and he basically says, "The question is not who will let me, but who will stop me." Kind of like, I'm not asking for permission, and I'm just creating because I am a prime mover. And this also kind of segues us into the next topic, because I'm very interested in like the cypherpunk movement that brought us Bitcoin, for example, and other great technologies that improve our lives. BitTorrent, for example, so a tool where you can join and exchange files, and computer files are also just information. So I guess they would fall under this lack of intellectual property. And for example, if you hear this podcast, this MP3 file, you didn't steal this from me. You just copied it, and I still have my original copy of it. So it's not like you go and break into my car and drive away, and now I don't have a way to get to work the next morning. But it was like this principle of scarcity doesn't apply in the digital realm. And I'm very interested on your thoughts concerning code, more specifically open source code, and how it relates to this lack of intellectual property that, there are these software licenses where some projects say, hey, our code is open source, but you cannot copy it and use it for commercial purposes, for example. Mm-hmm. And if I remember correctly, Rothbard also had this kind of approach to intellectual property, where he said, if I sell you a better mousetrap and I've in the contract written that you cannot rebuild it, even if you reverse engineer it by yourselves, then this is legitimate. Can you maybe speak on this a little bit?
Well, open source software, the way it's done now would not be possible without copyright. So basically, they do have these non-commercial provisions. And sometimes the Creative Commons licenses people use for publishing books and things, they'll put a Creative Commons ND/NC BY, meaning you have to give attribution, and you can't make derivative works, and you can't, like a translation or a movie version, and you can't make commercial profit off of it, which I don't understand this. You might as well just not have a license on, just use regular copyright, because no one can do anything with it. I despise all that stuff. I despise the share alike bullshit on software licenses. The software industry is somewhat open because they sense that copyright and patent would be bullshit, but they still cling to parts of it by doing this non-commercial crap and the share alike crap. If there was no copyright, then all software would just be open. You couldn't do anything about it. Now, you could have a specific contract. This is the mistake people make. They always say, well, you're effectively violating a contract if you copy someone's book without their permission. So they basically imagine that copyright law and patent law can be built on top of contract, which is what Rothbard sort of tries to do in one of his weakest and most confused arguments that he's ever done. Rothbard pioneered the title transfer theory of contract, which is revolutionary and groundbreaking and great. He wasn't a lawyer, so he had a couple little mistakes in there and things which I've tried to clarify and flesh out myself, knowing more about the law than he did. But it's a great thing. But he didn't even follow his own principles there, or his property rights principles, when he argued about this. His argument was basic. Well, first of all, he calls it. He says he's against patents, but he doesn't really give a good reason for it. It just says it distorts research. That's not really the fundamental case against patents. But if you understand this, patents cover inventions, right? Like a new mousetrap. Copyright covers artistic works, like a book or a movie or now copyright code. I'm sorry, software code. It didn't used to until some decisions in the 80s. People thought that software is functional. It's not a thing that you can. That copyright, it's not an expressive thing. It's not like a book you wrote. It's just code that performs a function. And of course, if you understand that what ROM is and how sometimes you have, software can be the equivalent of a ROM chip. I mean, it is functional, right? So copyright should never have been extended to it. It was always subject to patents, but you'd have to file a patent and find something unique about the flow chart or something, like a unique method. But so Rothbard's argument was that he's against patents, but he says, but for copyright, he goes, you could use contracts, you could stamp on your product like a mousetrap, like this is property of Rothbard. And so the first argument would be, well, if I sell 1,000 new mousetraps with a new, innovative feature, anyone can copy it. But Rothbard goes, yeah, but you could stamp each one with a notice saying, I'm only selling you the physical mousetrap, but I'm not selling you the ability to copy it. Okay, well, that's weird. It's not like there's an ability to copy built in to things. The ability to copy is my ability as a human actor to understand facts about the world and to use my stuff to do things. And so then Rothbard then says, aha, well, what about the third party? Like, even if you have a contract with all of your purchasers, all of your buyers have to sign on the dotted line saying, I promise I will never copy this mousetrap. Well, first of all, that's a stupid business model. It's never going to work because no one's going to buy your fucking mousetrap. Like, wait, I'm the guy paying you money and you want me to risk a lawsuit from you later if I use this thing in the wrong way? Fuck off, This business model is just stupid. It would not work. Okay, but in principle, I would concede that if the seller signs a contract with a buyer and the buyer agrees to pay monetary damages back to the seller, if he ever learns anything from this product or copies it or something or repairs it, I guess that contract would be enforceable. It would be stupid and you would hurt your profits because you're going to have to charge a much lower price to get people to, it's just not going to work. But okay, that contract would be enforceable. But then what if I sell this to someone else? Rothbard goes, well, the third party's bound too, because that right to copy was missing from that mousetrap. It's like, what the hell are you talking about? The third party didn't sign a contract with the seller. He's not under any obligation. And here's the other thing: a mousetrap is an invention, and yet Rothbard calls this contractual copyright. Copyright doesn't. It's for books. So he should call it contractual patent if he wants to be honest. Yet he said he's against patents, so he's totally confused. And an even more blatant example would be this. Even if you believe this mystical right to copy is not inside the mousetrap is missing. Let's say I find two abandoned mousetraps on the road. How do I know which one has a right to copy in it, which one doesn't? I mean, it's just a stupid metaphysical idea. But even if you accept that, let's take a book. So his argument would apply to books too, I think, because he used the word copyright, although the example he gives us a mousetrap. But so I've got a book, and the book says copyright Murray Rothbard, no one may copy this. Okay, I buy the book and I copy it and I put it on the internet. Now, let's say that I violated the contract and I have to pay him damages for doing something I agreed not to do. Okay, fine. But now the text, the information is up in the internet. It's just up in the cloud and people can see it on the internet. None of those people had a contract with Rothbard. And are you really saying that there's some pattern of words up in the ether that has a right to copy missing from it? What does that even mean? So the whole argument is completely confused and flawed and just wrong. It's just wrong. And so is every other argument that claims that people just are stupid, or they're dishonest, or they make dishonest and wrong and horrible arguments for IP. They'll say, well, it's just a copy. It's just a contract. It's like, it's not a contract. Trust me, if it was just a contract, why do you think every industry that depends upon copyright and patent would fight if you wanted to abolish patent and copyright law and just replace it with contract? Because they know that it wouldn't work. It does something different. That's why they want it. It's not contract. Or they'll say something like, "Oh, well, if you don't believe in copyright, you must be in favor of plagiarism." Or they'll say, "Oh, you believe in fraud." It's like, well, first of all, plagiarism and copyright infringement have or they'll say, "Oh, you don't believe in giving attribution to the owners." Again, attribution and credit, plagiarism and fraud have literally nothing to do with copyright. So, for example, if I copy J.K. Rowling's book and I keep her name on it, I'm giving her credit, but it's still going to be copyright infringement. Or if I copy 3 chapters from the Bible, which is not in copyright now, let's say an old copy that's out of copyright, or let's take a Shakespeare. I take a Shakespeare play and I turn it into my professor in college as my play. It's plagiarism, but it's not copyright infringement because there's no copyright on it. So they're totally unrelated things. And if I sell you a bootleg copy of a Harry Potter novel, and I tell you that it's a bootleg copy, but that's why I'm selling it to you for $3 instead of for $20. It's not fraud because the consumer knows he's getting a bootleg copy and he's fine with that because he wants to save money. So fraud and plagiarism and accreditation have nothing to do. I mean, look, it's legal to take Moby Dick or Romeo and Juliet. It's legal to publish them on Amazon right now. And it's legal to even put your name on it. Why does no one do this? Why don't we see Stephan Kinsella's Hamlet on Amazon? Because no one would buy it and everyone would look at you like you're an idiot. I mean, it's just, you don't need laws to stop this. So anyway, that's my rant about this. And I just hate people that make totally ignorant or dishonest arguments about this stuff. Or they'll say, "Oh, well, China's stealing our IP." It's like, what the fuck are you talking about? China has patent and copyright law, you moron. It's like, oh yeah, well, they make you do a joint venture if you want a factory over there to build smartphones, and then they make you team up with the locals to give them jobs, and then the locals copy it, and that violates trade secret rights. I'm like, well, that's because China doesn't have a free market, and they force you to partner up. It's not that they're stealing your IP. It's that you have to partner up with them as the price of doing business in China. And if you don't want to do it, don't do it. Pay the higher cost in Europe or America. Mm-hmm. But anyway, what does trade secret violation have to do with trademark and patent and copyright? I'm just I'm so sick of these people.
Yeah.
Oh, and then they'll say, well, if you're making a new drug that's going to save lives, like the COVID vaccines, which save so many lives, right? If you don't have patents on it, then how are people going to recoup their costs? It's like,
right.
So the purpose of government is to run around looking for people that can't recoup their costs enough to do some activity. And by the way, the costs are high because you make them go through this regulatory process with the FDA or the European, there's an equivalent European agency that costs them $1 billion in clinical trials. So the government puts $1 billion of cost on you, and now you complain you can't recoup the cost if you have competition on the free market. So we have to get rid of the free market by giving you a monopoly for 17 years in the form of a patent. Oh, and by the way, if it took you 5 years to get it approved, we're either going to extend the patent by another 5 years because it's unfair to let it expire after 12 now, or the FDA itself will just refuse to authorize a generic for 4 more years after your patent expires, thus extending your monopoly, your patent monopoly, even though it's expired. I mean, the whole thing is so corrupt and ridiculous. I mean, people say, well, you might have a case about patents in the case of most patents, but we do need them for pharmaceuticals. I'm like, no, pharmaceuticals are the worst case you could make for patents because the government is the cause of all this problem. And now you want the government to swoop in and fix the problem that they've caused. The whole thing is just maddening. And not only that, it's like, yeah, we really want more of these drugs that are emergency rush through and that are causing, I'm not going to say vaccine injuries. I don't know anything about this stuff, but I'm not as sanguine about the benevolent effects of the COVID vaccines as the establishment thinkers are. Put it that way.
Mm-hmm. All right. So let's follow this train of thought. I cannot own ideas, but the question then comes up: can I actually own crypto? Can I own Bitcoin? Because in the end, what I really do own is just the knowledge of some very high number on an elliptic curve. That is my private key,
Correct.
which I can use to fashion a digital signature,
Correct.
which will be recognized by the network as legitimate. And then, like the consensus, they will allow my transaction in a block. Can I own crypto?
And I've written on this. Okay, my view is the answer is no. You cannot own Bitcoin. But let's stop and think so ownership is a legal term that means the right, let's say the right to use or the right to control a resource. And again, the reason we need that is because, again, imagine the Robinson Crusoe case. He needs availability or access or actual control of scarce resources to get things done. He needs what we call possession. Now, laymen and non-lawyers sometimes use the word ownership. They would say he owns it, but ownership should be used to mean a property right in, not the possession of something. So there's a distinction between the right. That's why these rights emerge, these norms which say who the owner is, which means who's the person who should have the right to control it. So when these property norms emerge, they emerge again because of the possibility, the problem of conflict, the possibility that someone might want to take my scarce resources from me, and then I can't use them for my long-term projects, right? So these property norms emerge to counter that problem. If you had a resource that was literally impossible to be stolen, then you wouldn't need, look, if I was like an invulnerable Superman and I had a force field around my farm that was impenetrable and invulnerable, if everyone was like that, if it was like physically impossible for people to hurt each other, then we wouldn't have property rights. They wouldn't have emerged because you have something better than property rights. You actually have physical invulnerability, right? Now with Bitcoin, I think that the reason people say I own these Bitcoins is because they get in the habit of referring to things that they have the ability to use and usually they have the ability to use like their car and their house because the legal system and the society protects that right pretty well. Not in every case, but pretty well. I own my body because the law makes it illegal for someone to murder me, right? but people say they own their Bitcoins because the system, the cryptographic system and the scheme setup is so good that you effectively have invulnerability. No one, it's set up in a way that no one is able to take your, I wouldn't say you own your knowledge in your head either. I think you possess knowledge. I mean, to be technical. But yeah, see, to own a Bitcoin is really just to say, I possess the ability, the knowledge that allows me the ability to transfer the Bitcoin to someone else. And the system is set up to where no one else is able to do that. So the reason you can't own Bitcoin is, again, there is no such thing as a Bitcoin, really. It's just a mental concept and abstraction that we use to organize our joint understanding of the way this system works, right? It's a program running on distributed computers around the world, thousands of them, and they all maintain a linked up and regularly updated copy of a big spreadsheet or a big ledger, right? That's all. It's a ledger with entries on it. And if you were to own a Bitcoin, it means you own the way that this ledger is arranged. So let's say if someone steals my car, I can go get the car back, even if it's now in the hands of a third party who was an innocent third party. I can say, I'm sorry, you're in possession of stolen property. You've got to give it back to me because there's only one owner possible of this car, and that's me. And unfortunately, you lost the money you paid to the thief. Okay, whatever. If you owned a Bitcoin and someone stole it from you, and you could probably follow that Bitcoin right on the ledger from, where it's gone. Someone else some third party now has control of it. Let's say the guy steals it from you, and then by stealing from me, I mean he breaks into my home and he points a gun at my head and he makes me give my codes to him, right? Now he's committed a crime there. He's committed a crime against my body and my house. So I can go after the guy, but let's assume that he's long gone, or he's lost the Bitcoin. He stole. He spent the Bitcoin. He bought a house with the Bitcoin, or no, let's say he gambled the money away in Vegas, so it's all gone. So I can find my 10 Bitcoins. They're on the hands of someone in Las Vegas now, right? If I owned my Bitcoin, I could theoretically get a court order doing what? Making the entire world, all 10,000 Bitcoin nodes and miners, make them all roll back that on their computers? No, because I don't own their computers. I can't make them change the way they're configured. This is why it's impossible to own Bitcoins. Now, I will say also, you could make the same argument about modern fiat money. Now, I don't want to make that argument out loud, but too loudly, so I think in theory, it wouldn't matter in an advanced Bitcoin world. We would have contractual ways of working all this out. But you could make the same argument that no one really owns, say, dollars, because they're just, again, it's another digital currency. It's just serial numbers stored in the Federal Reserve's computers, right? And pieces of paper, which I think you don't technically own. The government lets you use them. But I don't really want to make that argument in the stated system. I mean, I would abolish the dollar and the fiat systems and the central banks. But until we do that, I'm okay with people going to court and getting an order of money and damages, even though theoretically you don't own fiat at all, because it's information in a sense, right?
I just want to make sure, is it okay if we continue for some more minutes, or do you have to run?
Yeah, I can talk for a few more minutes.
All right.
Maybe 15 minutes.
All right, cool. So I want to get your thoughts on hacking. If I brute force somebody's password just by guessing it 1,000,000 times, and then the computer system grants me access, and let's say I hack onto some server and now I have access to that server. Is that a crime when ideas cannot be possessed? What's your take on this?
It is. I think it is, and let me explain why. So the reason that let's say I somehow guessed your Bitcoin encryption keys. I mean, I know it's extremely unlikely, but I don't know. Maybe I have a quantum computer or something, which I think is all bullshit. But let's say I somehow guess your key, and then I use that to go into the Bitcoin network and transfer so-called your coins to my account. That's not, as far as I understand it, that's not prohibited by the terms of service of Bitcoin, because it's an open thing, and there's no contract violation whatsoever. Now, on the other hand, if I go into a bank, let's say, and I pretend to be you, and I fool the bank into giving me your money, I think that is a crime. And the crime is basically you're using the bank's resources without their permission, because clearly they're going to have a term of entry saying you can't come in here and pretend to be, someone else. Or if I use your password that I hacked by brute force, let's say you hacked into my computer at my home. I think what you're doing is you're using my resources without my permission. You're using my computer. You're using my hard drive, my memory bits, my electricity. You're physically using my home. Likewise, like if you have a neighbor with a big window and you can see into their house, and they're holding up a piece of paper and you can read with your binoculars or your telescope, you can read their password. I mean, they've given it away. You haven't committed any trespass. But for example, let's say they had a remote control helicopter a toy helicopter on their table, and you have the same one, and you have a remote control that you think you can find the right frequency to, and so you turn your little remote control on and you start flying his helicopter around in his kitchen, damaging things. I think that's an act of trespass. You're using his property without his permission, even though he made it easy for you to do it. If someone leaves their front door open, it doesn't mean if you walk into their house without permission, you're still committing trespass. If they forget to lock their door and it's easy for you to open it and come in, it's still trespass. So I would say that I think even spam and robocalls, annoying robocall, telemarketing calls, things where someone is literally like, if I call you at your house, I'm causing your phone to ring. And if you've told me, if it's clear or understood that you don't want that use to happen, then I'm using your resources without your permission. And I think technically it could be a tort or an offense or maybe even a crime. So yes, I think hacking can be prohibited in most cases, but not for open networks like Bitcoin, where it would only be a crime if you committed an act of force to get the password. So if I broke into your house and I found your book where you store your data, or if I use what do they call the $3 wrench hack, and I coerce you into giving it up, those are both crimes. So in that case, there's already a crime. But if you just somehow brute force or guess the password and you use it to access a network that doesn't prohibit that, like the Bitcoin network, I don't see that there's a crime at all.
But I don't understand what the difference is. So if I think there was this case where somebody hacked into Donald Trump's Twitter account just by guessing the password, like MAGA 2020 or something. But because I'm sure Twitter prohibits that. So you'll be violating the Twitter terms of service by using Twitter servers to access someone else's account. I'm sure that would be prohibited by the terms of service. But the thing is, there are no terms of service for Bitcoin. That's the difference. Right. But so, for example,
if Twitter said, hey, you can be a customer of Twitter, but if anyone else guesses your password, hey, it's free game, then it wouldn't be a violation of anyone's rights. But Twitter wouldn't have that business model because why? They're going to piss off customers.
Okay, so what about this example? If I run a server in my home that is exposed to the public internet and secured by a weak password with like one word, 5 letters, and you can scavenge the internet for these open connections, and then you discover my machine and you, start typing in one word and bang, you're in. Like, me as a private person, I don't have any terms of service. So would you consider that a crime then?
Yeah, they're still using your property without your permission.
Mm-hmm.
You didn't give them permission.
Okay.
You know, like let me give an analogy too. If you have a telephone, or if you have a telephone, you expect people to be able to dial your number and make it ring. But everyone knows no one wants robocalls. And you could put a notice up on the internet saying, "I do not welcome any robocalls." And then people know that they're using it without your permission and that they're committing a type of offense. Likewise, if you live in a normal neighborhood, you have a front door with a doorbell or a knocker, it's sort of an implied invitation to people to walk up to your front door on your sidewalk that you own and to push the button that you own or to knock on the door that you own. So they're using your property, but it's with your implied consent because of the customs in the area and because of what's assumed. But if you have a neighbor you hate and you tell them, do not ever fucking step a foot on my property, that person knows that they don't have that implied consent. Or if you have a sign up saying, no one is welcome to come on my property except for my mother, that's it. Then again, they would be committing trespass. So it depends upon what the understood communication would be. And the reason communication matters is because consent of the owner is what property rights are all about. And consent has to be communicated somehow. That's why language and communication are an essential aspect of human society and a law and order society. You have to be able to say yes or no. You have to be able to communicate. People have to understand each other to make agreements and contracts. So that's the difference. I would say in your case, even if he didn't have a password and he just like started using your computer without your permission to do Russian porn or something, you know, any reasonable juror would think the guy had to know that the owner of the computer did not want it being used this way. So it's trespass. There were some early cases about this actually, but I think CompuServe versus Cubby or something like back in the 90s or even the late 80s. So it's called trespass against chattels in the common law anyway. So, and I think that's roughly justified as a way of treating these types of things.
Mm-hmm. All right. I mean, amazing. Really interesting to hear your thoughts on all of these topics. So for my final question, I always ask the guests to recommend one book of fiction to our audience and to me. The last time, so we spoke on Clubhouse in 2020 when COVID was just hitting. And back then you recommended The Ungoverned by Werner Winch, which I read and I also enjoyed. I thought it was quite a bit chaotic, but still, nevertheless, the landscape and that life was just very fascinating.
For a fiction book, probably I shouldn't recommend a typical libertarian book because everyone's heard of those. One of my favorite books, I haven't read it in a long time, but it's called The King Must Die by Mary Renault. It's a retelling of the Theseus legend. So it's historical fantasy fiction. It's really good if you like that kind of work, but it's not libertarian at all.
All right.
And what's the other one? Nonfiction?
No, just one fiction book. I mean, nonfiction, there is so much, but I particularly enjoy these stories about this libertarian society. Yeah, we the theory is all very nice, but I really appreciate a story where these ideas get implemented like into everyday life, kind of like Atlas Shrugged from Ayn Rand.
Right. Yeah, I mean, there are some that I liked when I was in college, but I reread like J. Neil Schulman's classic book Alongside Night.
Yeah.
I thought I loved it in college, but when I reread it recently, I thought, oh man, this is not very good. There are a couple of, I'm violating the rules of your question, but there are two, I think, again, if I reread them, maybe I would think more poorly of them, but I remember enjoying in college 3 books by Neil Smith, and they're science fiction libertarian books, and they're called The Probability Broach and The Gallatin Divergence, and then the third one's Tom Paine Maru. He's got a lot of other ones that are more pulpy and a little schlockier, but those three I really enjoyed, especially the first two.
All right. So, dear listener, you will find the titles for these books in the show notes for this episode. And yeah, I want to thank you, Stephan, for taking the time and answering my questions. And yeah, hope to speak to you soon.
Enjoyed it. Thanks so much.
And that was that. Or so I thought. I thought Stephan was pressed for time and needed to leave immediately, but that wasn't the case. He stuck around a little bit and asked me about Monero. And so here is the conversation I had with Stephan after the podcast, so to say. He agreed that it's okay that I publish this, so enjoy our discussion about Monero, Bitcoin, fungibility, and all that good stuff.
Anyone I hear on this topic. Here's the way I think about it. First of all, fungibility is not an inherent property of something, right? It's a subjective quality. It depends upon how the market. I mean, theoretically, even gold coins are not fungible because theoretically you could trace every atom in a gold thing. You could if it was worth doing, but people choose whether or not they. It's like when people call something a public good or a private good or a consumer good or a consumption good. It depends upon consumer evaluations and preference, right? I mean, seashells have been money, but they're not perfectly identical, but they were identical enough where people disregarded their differences and they treated them more or less as fungible. Probably the same thing with cigarettes in jail, right? Or something like that. And it seems to me that so far the market seems to regard Bitcoin as fungible enough to do its function. I would agree that if we were starting from scratch and if we had something that was very similar to Bitcoin, which also was anonymous or whatever you want to call it to make it more fungible, that probably would be good. But I don't know whether its imperfections now are enough to doom it. The market doesn't seem to think so far, right? It's already it seems to be being staying the dominant thing. So here's my approach to this. And tell me where you think I'm wrong. First of all, I don't know what maximalism is because everyone I hear that says they're one, they have a different view. And half of their arguments are shitty. Like they'll just call every other coin a shit coin, but they don't give a reason why.
Right.
I mean, some of them are scams, obviously, but like why is Bitcoin Gold or Dogecoin or Litecoin or BCH or BSV, why are they shit coins? I guess you could say that Bitcoin has the longest chain or whatever, although I don't know, doesn't BCH have the same length because he copied? So I don't know. My view is this: people trade because trade is advantageous, but there's two problems with a barter society, right? The first problem is increment, the double coincidence of ones, right? The second problem is inability to economically calculate because you don't have money prices that you can use to compare heterogeneous goods. And so money arises because it solves both problems, right? And then, but once you have money, you have to recognize that it's not wealth. Again, the example I gave earlier about like, why don't we just print more money? It's like money is not wealth. People don't understand that. And because money is not wealth, more money doesn't make us wealthier. Like any supply of gold would work within a range, right? Which is why I think gold mining is wasteful and inefficient and a bad thing and causes inflation and causes not theft because it's legitimate, but it's non-ideal as money, but it's still damn good because it's got a low stock to flow ratio, right? But it's also a useful good, and so that's a bad thing. But well, that's why it became money. But it's also, if it's used as money, then it gets this monetary premium, and that means that you're taking useful things out of. It could be used for industry or for jewelry, but now it's being wasted. So I think a digital money is definitely coming because it can have the advantages of gold, but it can be better, right? For all the obvious reasons. But I think just like in a world, there always would, we only need one money. We're used to every country having their money because we fucked it all up with fiat currencies. But as Hoppe and others write, there would be a tendency towards one money because like gold or silver or something like that. I think we had gold and silver because gold is so valuable that you need small change. But with Bitcoin, you don't need that, right? It's digital. So you don't need. So I think that there's going to be a tendency for the world to move to one digital currency someday. And the reason is it will fix the problem that the government's money fixes the barter problem, and then government money comes in and fucks up money. So now digital money can get money back to what it used to be, but even better maybe, right? So the whole purpose, so I would say, like, if you think of gold is 90% good money, it's good enough to be a really useful thing. And then the government comes in with fiat and fucks it up, right? And let's say Bitcoin is not ideal, but let's say it's like 98% good money. It's very close to the ideal. But all you need is one currency to be the new money. And it's just so much better than fiat that I don't see Bitcoin number 2 replacing the Bitcoin number 1 if it's just like 1% better. Because once the money's installed, it's going to be hard to dislodge it. Now, so then the question is, we have like 15,000, 20,000 cryptocurrencies out there. I would guess one of those is probably going to be the one that's going to be the eventual world currency. Which one? I just think it's more likely that it's going to be Bitcoin because it's the biggest. And so it's just like Facebook is, had once you get network effects, then, and could you say Monero or maybe Bitcoin SV or slightly better than Bitcoin? Maybe.
I'm just a Monero guy. I don't believe in Bitcoin Cash or Bitcoin SV because Monero is actually an innovative protocol, like based on its own white paper, and it has it's not a code fork, chain fork of Bitcoin. It's just its own thing that
I got that.
The concepts and build upon it. And they built a layer of mandatory obfuscation into the protocol. So every transaction has to be obfuscated in order to be a valid transaction. And so you end up with a blockchain that still is verifiable with cryptography, but you cannot just by looking at it tell, okay, transaction A sent this amount to transaction B. Like all of these, the sender, receiver, and amount of every transaction is hidden. And I think we are seeing an epic play out, which is going to take some decades. So the new money is not established overnight. And also when I think about money, I think the medium of exchange utility is first and foremost, and from that logically follow the store of value and unit of account characteristics. And if we look, for example, at darknet markets, so markets that have to operate outside of the law, they are more and more opting for Monero because it's less of an operational risk for them. Yeah, if they use Bitcoin and then cash out, they may get caught, and a lot of people have been caught this way. So I think the market hasn't spoken yet. It's a discovery process, and we're still witnessing it. And it's a very.
When did Monero start?
It started in 2014. We're just about to have the 10-year anniversary on the 18th of April.
And what is its price done since then? Like, where is it now?
I mean, it's gone up a bit. It's the meme is like it's the new stable coin at around $150. In terms of price appreciation, Bitcoin is much more ahead, but Monero is kind of flying under the radar. The technologically versed people, they kind of understand it, and even like the Bitcoin maximalists, quote unquote, who understand technology will say, okay, everything is a shitcoin except for Bitcoin and maybe Monero, because they actually do technological stuff. But the price isn't quite there, but also this is not a focus of the community. The community is really focused on building a solid technological basis, and everything will follow from that. So
is it like is it a blockchain based system?
Yeah, it's
and does it update every 10 minutes like Bitcoin?
The block time is a little bit shorter. It's 2 minutes only. There are some tweaks they did, like innovation. So they don't have a hard capped supply. Instead, they have a soft capped supply with a static tail emission. So every block 0.6 Monero get emitted, and that into infinity. And like, if you look into this, it's really fascinating, because if you assume some percentage of keys get lost every year, eventually it will hit an equilibrium of, so it's de facto capped, although in the code it is uncapped. And there are some more differences here and there. But
is that one of the criticisms by the maxis, that it doesn't have a fixed cap?
I think the strongest criticism is that in Monero you have a new kind of inflation bug. In Bitcoin, every inflation bug is a detectable inflation bug, meaning that it's visible on the blockchain since all amounts are transparent. Whereas in Monero, every transaction hides the amount behind a zero knowledge proof that basically proves that there is no new coins created with that transaction. So no negative amount is spent. But
so are there miners and node operators just like in Bitcoin?
Just like in
Monero?
Bitcoin, just like proof of work, UTXO set so it's not like in Ethereum with the accounts, but with UTXOs.
So every 2 minutes, someone mines a block and they get some reward, but because it's anonymous, we don't know what the reward was.
No, we know that the reward. So there is some amounts that are transparent. One is the Coinbase amount. So you can just look at the block and see that a certain number of coins were minted. And this has to be the case in order to sum up all of the Coinbase transactions and arrive at the current supply. And all of the fees are also visible. So you can calculate or just by looking at the block, how much the miner is earning. But apart from that, the amounts are hidden.
Well, are you familiar with a guy named Johann Gievers?
No.
I think he's in Canada, but I think he's Swiss. He was at the Hoppes conference with me maybe 7-8 years ago. And he was at the time heavily involved with Tezos, and he was trying to promote that and explaining to me why it was better and trying to get me to invest in it. Of course, they had some huge clusterfuck after that. But are you familiar with Tezos? Yeah,
but I've heard of it, but I couldn't give you a technical analysis of it.
Well, at the time, I didn't know enough about Bitcoin's technology to even understand these alleged advantages. And I also didn't have this sort of maxi view that there's going to be convergence to one. I mean, no, if you're right about Monero being basically as good as Bitcoin, but better in some other ways, I mean, maybe it will be the one. I don't care which one's going to be the one, except I'm going to get rich if this Bitcoin. But
right, yeah, I don't either. All I care about is the separation between church and money. But
me too. I just want there to be one good digital currency that's going to win. I just don't see that the market seems to think this fungibility issue is the problem. I mean, does Monero have an advantage in energy use or anything like that, or is it roughly the same kind of thing?
The only difference is that it's a ASIC-resistant proof-of-work algorithm. So even with some consumer hardware, you can mine or participate in mining. But apart from that, it's just proof-of-work, and you have to spend energy to guess a valid hash for the block to get accepted. But
would you agree that if a digital money is going to take over, it's probably just going to end up being one. We don't need 17 different.
Absolutely,
one for this purpose and one for. And what about second layer solutions for Bitcoin, like Lightning Network and other things? Couldn't they adopt some of the privacy aspects?
Some, but as far as I understand it, there is always you build this layer cake, right? And if you have certain compromised or a certain information leaking from the base layer, then everything that you stack on top will still leak that information. So for example, with Bitcoin and the Lightning Network, if I open a Lightning channel to you, I still have to use my UTXO set that is risk profiled by a Chainalysis company. So, yeah.
Aren't there something called, there's some word the Bitcoiners use. It's like an anonymizer thing. Like you put your bits in and they come out anonymized.
A coin
somehow.
join?
Maybe a coin join, something like that. Yeah.
Yeah. So those are obfuscation techniques. The issue I see with that, it's always opt-in. it's opt-in privacy, meaning only people who really want it, who need it, will do it. And this leads to a smaller anonymity set. And the better way is to have opt-out privacy. Everything is private by default. And if you need to have transparency, you can opt out and reveal your transaction. But the defaults really matter. And this is, I think, shown by computer software. Most people get a PC and they use the browser that's pre-installed. They use the search engine that's pre-installed. And that's like 80% of the user base. And so
what would you say are what is the main objection to Monero from Bitcoin enthusiasts?
So the main objection is that theoretically you can have an undetectable inflation bug, meaning since amounts for every transactions are hidden, this means that we assume or have to assume that the cryptography, the theoretical underpinning of the zero-knowledge proof is sound. That's one. And I think that's an easy assumption to make. Although I cannot verify it myself, but just being around the scene, I think that the much harder one is actually making the implementation, like implementing that sound theory. And in the implementation, you could have a bug where, I don't know, suddenly I can create with a transaction to myself 10 gajillion new Monero, and then, I mean, this would be the death of the project, because, you have somebody who is basically the central bank, and the users don't even know about this. And that's, I think, the worst part. And to that...
So there's no way to know the current supply of Monero?
No, there is. So again, like assuming that the cryptography and the implementation of it is sound, you can just sum up all of the Coinbase transactions, which have a transparent amount, and you arrive at the current supply of Monero. But that is assuming the zero-knowledge proofs are implemented correctly. And I mean, the project does audits, so they hire external companies that audits the innovation, and this is funded by the community because there is no company behind it. But nevertheless, I have to concede that it's a possibility. And in the end, I guess it's just a matter of personal risk assessment and saying, well, I think this is a very high likely possibility, so I'm not even going to put 1 cent towards it. And if you say this is an impossibility, I'm going to all in Monero, like that's where in between those two extremes is where you're going to fall.
See, my view is that what I envision happening is that let's say Bitcoin becomes adopted somehow. We have this hyper Bitcoinization or whatever. All my Bitcoin friends think that then everyone would just keep their savings and their wealth in Bitcoin. Not everyone, but most people, because most people are just not experts at the stock market and all this, and they shouldn't be in the stock market now. They're only in the stock market now because they have to chase returns because there's inflation. I don't think that's right. I think if you have this new digital money, it wouldn't be new by the time it got adopted. It might be 30 years old, but okay, still, it's a technology. I think people would only keep a fraction of their wealth in that money for a few reasons. Number one, I think, let's say you keep 10% of your wealth in cash, in Bitcoin. 90% you keep in stocks in the stock market for diversification, in case Bitcoin crashes someday, or it gets superseded by a better one, or there's a bug discovered, right? And also because you can probably make about as much if you do an index fund in the stock market, maybe even a little bit more. I don't know. But I don't think people would keep all of their wealth in the money, which means that it doesn't really matter what the money is. Like, okay, so 30 years from now, everyone's humming along and Bitcoin has made the world better. But then this Monero thing, like, or Bitcoin 2, whatever, starts gaining steam and somehow dislodges Bitcoin. Maybe Bitcoin went offline and no one knows why, and everyone panics. But you would only lose 10% of your wealth, not all of it, right? And so then we have then we would adopt the money that's 99% good, because now we have to start from scratch. And okay, that might be Monero or something. So I don't think the existence, let's say Monero became the main money that you're talking about. Okay, there's a risk that there might be a bug that someday discovered. What's the worst case? So then the whole network collapses and people lose 10% of their wealth, and we adopt Monero 2 improved version or something. So I don't. Does that make sense to you? That perspective?
Yes and no. So, I mean, I've kind of gotten away from thinking that we will have a world money anytime soon. I think this experiment of cryptocurrency is playing out in the niches first, and we will, at least to my mind, have to see a successful example of a society, like a group of people who prove that it's possible. And so, for example, if a darknet market administrator doesn't get caught because he's using Monero only on his exchange, then this is going to be an incentive for more darknet market administrators to do the same. And I think if, like, we have in El Salvador the Bitcoin beach, like, if they are able to show that this is successful, more and more communities will adopt it. But what we are witnessing right now is the crackdown of the regulators towards that offensive kind of technology that takes their power underneath them and allows people to opt out. So they will crack down or try to crack down on cryptocurrencies. And since Bitcoin has this transparency, this only pseudonymous ledger, I think this can be a pitfall. And if you want to read some amazing piece about this, there is this darkfi.manifest. I will send you the link via email. And they talk about this concept that crypto, so the crypto space, will split into two. There will be RegFi, which is the regulated finance, that's KYC'd, AML, all of the regulatory stuff. You're completely naked in front of the regulator when you use it, and it will be toothless. And on the other hand, you will have DarkFi, which is the dark financial system that is hidden behind cryptography, where users are anonymous, developers are anonymous, node operators are anonymous. Everything is verified by cryptography, but you don't know the actual identities. And this will be the true revolution of cryptocurrencies. And this is kind of like the rabbit hole that I've been falling down for the past year. This is called the Luna Punk ethos. I will send you some resources on this. There is an excellent video about this that is like 10 minutes long, and it just explains this dualism between the optimistic solar punk, which is characterized by everything is transparent, and we're going to hope that the regulator doesn't crack down. And then on the other hand, we have lunar punk, which is we will hide everything behind cryptography. We will prepare for the state to crack down on us, and we will be the project that survives. And I think this is
interesting. That's fast. I didn't know anything about this. That's fascinating.
Yeah, I mean, I can't believe that I get to like participate in this and witness it playing out in real time. This is an amazing time we live in.
Well, my view is I've been learning in successive waves of understanding this, and I started buying a few Bitcoins because I lost a bet. And I think it was in it was $30 a Bitcoin at the time. So it was either 2011 or 2012. I can't remember. I bet my friend VJ Boyapati, the guy that wrote The Bullish Case for Bitcoin. We were talking on this list. We were talking about Bitcoin since like 2010 or 11 on this list. And even at the time I said, this seems to me like it could be close to being the ideal money, right? I didn't understand all the technical details, the pseudonymous nature. But in the beginning, and I bet him, I said, listen, I think it has potential. I don't agree with these Austrians who say that Mises' regression theorem proves that a digital money could never become money because it's not a useful commodity. I never believed that at all. I thought that was a misinterpretation of Mises' regression theorem. But what I said was, dude, if this Bitcoin thing catches on, the government's just going to outlaw it. So I said, I will bet you that, I think it was $6 at the time. And I said, I'll bet you that by the end of the year, it's like less than $2. I bet him like $100. And so by like late that year, it was $30. And I said, I don't want to wait till March. I said, you've won the bet. I mean, it's quadrupled in price. Obviously, it's not going to be $2. I said, give me your PayPal or whatever. I'll send you $100. He says, I'll take 3 Bitcoins instead if you want, but you got to figure out how to buy them. Like he was being sneaky, right? So I had to go to Coinbase and I bought 3 Bitcoins for $30. And I bought 2 more for me. I figured, well, might as well buy a couple more. So that's how I got into it, right? And then I went to this cryptocurrency conference and I spoke at it on legal tender issues in Atlanta in 2013. It was one of the first ones. Jeff Tucker arranged it. But I remember then everyone was talking about it. They were thinking of it like a PayPal thing. Like they were thinking, oh, isn't it cool? You can pay for a cup of coffee with this. And it is cool, but it doesn't solve a problem because you can pay for a cup of coffee with dollars. Like money, the dollar works fine for transactions. It works fine. And it's just as quick and all that. And so I think they were thinking of it like a PayPal or what Venmo has become. And so that's why they didn't think, oh, it's $30 now, it's $100. They didn't think that it might hit $10 million. They weren't imagining it would sort of replace the intermediary function of all money as a store of wealth or something like that, you know? And I didn't really realize any of that until that 2017 block size war thing. And then I got a little bit more sophisticated. I remember when I got the reason I didn't want your Monero is like, I don't do these things for money. And also I just don't want the hassle of another system. And I already had some complications after that block size war. When they split, I got a bunch of Bitcoin Cash because, you know, it was like an airdrop or something. And I just sold them all. I sold them all in December and January for like $3,600, $2,500. I bought a car off of that shit. And I was glad to get rid of Bitcoin Cash. And I said, I just want to stick with, but I don't even want like the IRS to think I've got all these other crypto accounts where I've got to keep track of it. I just want to have one simple one. But my view is that Bitcoin is not really necessary or usable now for 2 reasons. Number one, the dollar works fine for transactions. And number 2, there is capital gains taxes. And I can't imagine that also doesn't apply to Monero. And so to me, it's a nightmare. So I just think as a store of value, its value can keep going up. And then it's going to get to a point where it's too late to outlaw it. And then it will start, when it plateaus in price at $10 million or whatever, then people will start just using it as money, maybe through Lightning Network. That's kind of my crazy utopian vision for this. But your vision seems to be more like the Bitcoin Cash people who like criticize Bitcoin for sabotaging the block size increase and all this stuff and making it not usable for its original function. But its original function to them was to be a PayPal. And it seems like to you and your darknet people, it's for doing, I won't say illicit things, but things you don't want the government to know about, which I understand. I just don't, I guess I see it going the other way, like some of the hyper Bitcoin, like getting high enough in value, and then it'll finally start being used. And by the way, the technology should be worked out by then for secondary layer solutions and all that kind of stuff. That's kind of how I see it. But I admit it's a huge gamble and a risk and uncertain. I think that we've never seen this before in the history of mankind. So we don't know how a digital currency is going to end up being adopted. It could be your way. It could be the Bitcoin Cashers way. It could be the Bitcoin way. You know what I mean? I agree. It's fascinating to live through it and see it. I don't think anyone knows how this is really going to play out. Wouldn't you agree with that?
Yeah, I mean, for sure. And like we said before, I don't consider myself a Monero guy, and I will stick to that project until the day I die. It's more I see this as the best implementation for claiming my personal freedom right now. And that's what I go.
Yes, you actually want to use it right now.
Yes,
that's the thing.
Use it right now and use it in such a way that is like privacy preserving. And I'm not sure how deep you've gotten into Bitcoin, but this risk profiling, and it comes also with managing your outputs. You have to be very careful in Bitcoin that you don't consolidate a lot of outputs maybe, because that would reveal to some observer that all of those were actually yours. And then they can retroactively trace that. And that's the thing with the blockchain, it doesn't forget anything. And you can, I don't know, you are some kid and you buy some drugs on the darknet market, and you do that when you are young, you forget about it. And then 10 years later, you come back and you find that Bitcoin wallet again, you have forgotten all about it. You join it with your other Bitcoins, and suddenly you made that link to your identity, and it can bite you in the ass. And that's how some of the scams have also been apprehended in the past, because the people were not knowledgeable enough to manage their outputs. And I have to be honest, I'm not knowledgeable enough either. If I really try hard, I could maybe do it. Also with the Lightning node, like the thing about Bitcoin and crypto is I want to be my own bank. And so using Lightning for me is only an option if I use my own node and I'm not a customer of some custodian again. Like, I don't want to have another PayPal. I want to be my own bank, and I want to send money to anybody in the world without asking for permission, without anybody knowing about it, actually. And now I lost my train of thought. But anyway, so with Monero, what I appreciate, I'm just like you, I don't have a lot of coins. I have Bitcoin, I have Monero, that's it. I don't like the hassle of managing wallets. It's way too much overhead for me. I think the biggest risk is actually myself, locking myself out of my account, not being hacked or something. And so I want to keep it simple for myself. And with Monero, I kind of have more of a ease of mind, because I know that the protocol is already obfuscating stuff. So I have to watch out less. And I think as the crackdown gets worse and worse, I live in Germany. There is a lot of discussion for CBDC to be introduced here. And eventually I see this going to the point where you cannot use cash anymore, or you can use cash, but only until 500 euros. And with the inflation, that's going to buy you like a piece of bread. And so it's really not going to do anything. I think we will see this divide in the space. And then, I really am hopeful that, for example, Monero and other privacy preserving technology is going to be more attractive to people then, because I think if you understand how to manage a Bitcoin wallet, you also know how to manage a Monero wallet. It's just, you have some different words, but it's also a wallet application. You also have receive addresses, and it's just the same. It's just a different protocol underneath. So hopefully in a few years, we'll have a user experience that's good enough. And then that's I think, Bitcoin has the network effect, but I don't think that means that it has won the race already. I think, and I really appreciate Bitcoin. I also hold it. I'm just a little bit more skeptical than the average maxi, and I don't like the dogma of saying, oh, Bitcoin was first, Bitcoin number one, number go up. I like to be a little bit more critical and also think about ways it could fail. And I think this regulatory crackdown could really be one.
Well, we'll see what happens.
Yeah.
All right. I appreciate that. That's useful. Yeah. Send me the information. I'll take a look.
All right. Amazing. So have a nice day. And thank you again so much for taking the time. All right. That was it for real. If you enjoyed this episode and want to make sure you don't miss the next one, go to AlexAnarcho.live. You will find a button to subscribe to the RSS feed on the landing page. Just press that, go to your favorite podcasting app, and subscribe to the feed. Also, I just want to give another shout out to all the anonymous heroes that make this podcast possible. Thank you for supporting, and thank you for listening. See you in the next one.